The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act was passed with much fanfare 10 years ago. Now, 10 years later, the provincial government is planning to scale back enforcement of that act. This news comes just a week and a half after an independent review called for more robust enforcement to protect the rights of people with disabilities. It is estimated that 60% of businesses with at least 20 employees are still not in compliance with the legislation. So why is it that the government is pulling back on enforcement of the law? David Lepofsky is chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. David, good morning.
Good morning.
What was your reaction when you heard that the province would be easing enforcement of this act?
This is really, really appalling. The government's already been doing a paltry job of enforcing this law. An independent review that the government itself appointed told it a week ago that the government needs to strengthen the enforcement of the act because after 10 years, the legislation hasn't made a significant impact on the lives of people like us who have disabilities. The government's solution, instead of showing the strong new leadership that the independent review conducted by Professor Mayo Moran recommended, is actually going the wrong way and decided to cut back on its already paltry enforcement. Makes no sense.
What is not being done in those 60% of businesses that have more than 20 employees? What are they not complying with?
Well, we so far know, and the government knows, this is in a letter from the government to us. We pressed for this information. Businesses and other organizations with at least 20 employees were required to file an accessibility self-report in 2012 and again in 2014, where they simply self-report on whether they've established a customer service accessibility policy and the appropriate requirements that they need to fulfill, whether they've trained their staff on it and they've got a feedback mechanism so we can report concerns. It's pretty basic stuff. And the government knows, because these are supposed to be e-filed, who's filed and who hasn't. So it's not like they got to go out and find that out. They already know that there is this rampant noncompliance. Yet up until about a year ago, November, they weren't doing anything to enforce it using compliance orders or monetary penalties. We first raised this publicly in November of 2013. The government said, this is awful, we've got to do better. And a year and a quarter later, what we're finding is that was a flash in the pan. Now they're talking about scaling things back. And this isn't because the government hasn't got enough money on hand to undertake these enforcement activities. Right. The office that the government is charged with this responsibility, we've revealed, has been under budget every year since 2005, meaning it's spent less than it was given, sometimes in the tune of like $2.5 million a year.
What does that say to you, given the fact that this act was, as I said, introduced 10 years ago with great fanfare?
Well, having had the privilege of leading the volunteer campaign across this province from 1994 to 2005 to win this law, we were really excited when it was passed, and now we are enormously frustrated that the government is prepared to pass it but not prepared to effectively implement it. And when their own independent review comes out and says, not making much of a difference, enough of a difference in the lives of people with disabilities, government, it says, show new leadership. It points directly to Premier Wynne and says, you've got to take the reins on this file and show some strong leadership. And the government's solution is to come out and brag and claim to be world leaders on accessibility, which they're most assuredly not.
Why would they not move on this, though?
You're asking the question that we'd like to know the answer on. Nobody's ever given us a straight answer. It's bad policy. It's also going to be a global embarrassment in a few months because all eyes will be on Toronto for the Pan and Para-Pan American Games. They're expecting hundreds of thousands of tourists. That includes a lot of people with disabilities.
In the meantime, though, you have a lot of people with disabilities who live here right now. What does this mean for them if, as I said, 60% of these businesses aren't complying?
It means that we are going to continue to face a lot of problems trying to make use of stores and restaurants and public services and public transit and all those kinds of things that are supposed to become, that the legislation requires to become fully accessible by 2025. There is a toll-free number, by the way, which the government has told us about. We've been pressing for this for years, and now they've told us there is one that you can call to report violations of the Disabilities Act. It's 866-515 2025. But it's the best kept secret. They don't. If you go to their website, they don't describe it as a place to report toll violations.
But the lack of accessibility is no secret. I mean, we keep hearing from people even this morning, but we've done stories on this. You look at transit in this city and how difficult it is to get around and how they're trying to ramp up, and that's going to take a bit longer. But other areas around the city where accessibility is not a priority at all.
Well, it's bizarre because while the province is not doing an effective job in forcing to get these businesses to become accessible, we've got the City of Toronto trying to force a restaurant, the Signs Restaurant, to tear down a ramp they put up, trying to force it to become inaccessible. There's something really wrong in our community when the government power is more effectively wielded to oppose accessibility than to enforce it.
A spokesperson for the government says that it's shifting focus this year to concentrate on pilot projects with the Ministry of Labour and Transportation to improve compliance with the Act. So do you give them the benefit of the doubt there that they're trying to educate
nonsense.
first?
We've been pressing that idea with them since about 2011, and it's not a matter of shifting emphasis. That was to expand enforcement, not to contract it. They said that they did 2,000 audits in 2013, 2,000 audits in 2014, and they've told us they're only going to do 1,200 in 2015. That's a 33 or something % cut in audits, which is still a paltry number of organizations, given that they know there are 33,000 or so violators.
So just finally and briefly, the law calls for a fully accessible Ontario by 2025. Is it even likely that we'll get anywhere near that?
Not unless the Premier listens to the recommendations of the independent review that she appointed and shows the strong leadership that she's promised, but sadly isn't delivering.
David, thank you.
Thank you.
David Lepofsky, Chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, talking about the fact that the Ontario government is scaling back enforcement of that act, despite the fact that more than 60% of businesses with 20 or more employees are not actually complying with the accessibility laws in Ontario.